Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Amanda, and I'm coming to you live from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. And we're so happy you decided to join us today to learn more about kelp forests and conservation. Now, what we're going to do is give you a chance to participate with us. And we have a special text that you can use if you are watching this live. You may text your responses and your questions to this number here. It's also written on the bottom of your screen, but 562-286-1838. Now, if you happen to be watching this later, you can email your questions to live@lbaop.org. That's LB for Long Beach, aquariumofpacific.org. So we encourage you to text in any questions that you have or any comments you'd like to make as we talk about the subject today. So let me put this down. And I'd like to also let you know that I'm coming to you from our studio here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. So I have my friend James, who is going to be helping pull up some clips for me as we do some exploring in the kelp forest. I also have my friends Dave and Alicia, who are helping answer your questions as they're coming in. So we're all working on this together, keeping our physical distance from each other, but really excited that you've decided to join us today. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at a kelp forest. So we're going to, first of all, talk about what this is. I'm going to give you a chance to make some observations on your own. I'll kind of stand off to the side. But what kinds of things do you notice about the kelp forest? Now, maybe you're at home and you've got someone else in the room. You guys can make observations together and talk to each other. Or again, you can text us if you're watching this live. But look at this kelp. And what do you notice about it? What does it remind you of? What does it look like it's doing? What are the special features that you see about it? Well, we're going to take a closer look at some of this kelp. So this is what we would call a kelp forest. But of course, for a forest, there needs to be many of the one thing we're talking about, in this case. But let's take a look a little bit more specifically at kelp and learn then a little bit more about the kelp forest and the animals that live in it. So right here in my hands, I have some artificial kelp. And if you look at it, and if you look at what you're seeing in that video, I'd love to hear what kinds of observations you notice. What does it remind you of? Does it look like anything else that we think of on land? Because what is kelp? Obviously, it's not an animal, but is it a plant? The answer to that is no. Believe it or not, kelp is not a plant. Rather, it is an algae, or it is algae. Now, if you look at this, it has a lot of parts that look very similar to plants. This right here, any idea what that could be? What does that look like? It looks kind of like, well, it reminds me of roots that you might see on a plant. And I want you to think about what roots do for a plant. Well, they anchor the plant into place, right? They also get nutrients from the soil for the plant as it grows. However, there's something that's different about this for kelp. This is called a holdfast, and the holdfast is not a set of roots that's collecting nutrients, but it is helping anchor the kelp to the ground. Or when I say the ground, it could be a rock or something heavy on the bottom of the ocean floor, a surface that it can kind of wrap itself around. So this is just an artificial piece, but I do have another piece that's kind of dried out. But this is an example of what the bottom of kelp looks like. The kelp would be growing up from here, and this is the holdfast. Now, this one's all dried out. Normally it would be much thicker and maybe a little bit more green in coloration. But I can bring it over here to give you a closer view over at my camera. So we can kind of zoom in a little bit. And I want you to think about what other purposes this might serve the kelp. Rather than just holding it in place, since it's not drawing nutrients, is there any other organism that could benefit from the holdfast? Is there anything you can think of? Here's the other side of it there. Give you another view. May not be the prettiest looking thing, but it does serve an important purpose. Now, somebody put a comment in that it looks like a rainforest. Though, yes, that kelp forest does look very much like a rainforest. And we'll go back to that and try to make some comparisons to a rainforest a little bit later. But I wanted to give you a chance to take a closer look at some kelp. Or I'm sorry, the holdfast of the kelp. Now, I know we have some other questions coming in, so I'd love to still hear your comments. Oh, let's see, you might also notice that there are kind of two different colors here. This is the darker side and this is the lighter side. And exactly why they're two different colors? It's just basically rotting differently. So this one, maybe it was just dried out more in the sun, or this one, I don't know exactly why they have the two different colors, but it is a really good, interesting observation. And yeah, I wish I could tell you exactly why, that there was some really fancy scientific process that was happening here that would blow your minds, but I don't know what that is. But yeah, they are different colors. They just simply are rotting differently. So that is the holdfast. Now, getting back to my sample here. So here is a small holdfast for this little kelp sample that I have, but it can be much thicker, as you can see, much bigger. Oh, and I'm so glad someone did have a response for what else could this be used for, this holdfast. Someone said it could be used for protection for fish, and you're exactly right. And obviously not a really large fish. A large fish would not be able to fit inside of this, but some smaller fish, maybe larval stages of fish in their smallest baby forms, but also a lot of invertebrates. Now that's a term you should be familiar with. Invertebrates are animals that don't have backbones, and if you think about it, there's a lot of invertebrates that live on the bottom of the ocean floor. You can probably think of a number of them. You can name them out, but we've got crabs. There can be worms. There can be clams. There can be scallops. There can be little tiny shrimp and plankton of different sorts that could be kind of hanging out around those areas where there might be food. So yeah, lots of different animals. In fact, I want to say up to, someone can give me the exact number in the studio, but around 1 million species, I think, have been discovered that could be living in one holdfast of a kelp, which is pretty amazing. So the holdfast itself provides habitat and shelter for animals, as well as the rest of this. So let's take a closer look at kelp. And notice that it has this big, long, sort of, what looks like a stem. You might think of it as a stem if you were thinking of a plant that goes up. But it's not very stiff. It's very flexible. So as you were noticing in the kelp forest, how it's kind of swaying with the water, well, that's really important. If this was really stiff and tall, that wave action is probably going to just break those off. So it's really important that it has that flexibility and it can move with the water. Oh, 90 species. So 90 different species of animals have been found in kelp, but that can support up to 1 million animals. That's pretty amazing. But 90 different species have been discovered in the holdfast of some kelp. So that's pretty amazing. All right, so we've got the stem, or what looks like the stem, called the stipe. So it has an ST sound to it as well. But the stipe of the kelp is what helps it to stretch up and support all of these different blades that you're seeing. So these things that look like leaves are what we call blades. And this is also what's doing some of the work that we might expect the roots to do on plants. It's actually getting the nutrients from the water. So the holdfast can help hold the kelp in place so it's not swaying all over the place and not floating all over the ocean. It's just got one basic anchor to grow off of and grow up. And then the blades are where the nutrients are being gathered for this organism. Now, also attached to those blades, you'll see this funny little, looks like this little air bladder here, and it's called a pneumatocyst. A pneumatocyst is filled with gas that will help the kelp to float. Now, think about why the kelp would want to float. Why would it be important? Why can't kelp just cover the ocean floor? Create a nice little carpet on the ocean floor. And so why doesn't it just do that? It's kind of flopped over. And so it seems like that would be the most natural thing to do. But they do have these air bladders, so there must be some purpose for it. So think about, I'm not going to tell you right away why they have these air bladders, but I'd like you to think about it. And if anyone can text in to 562-286-1838 and tell me why you think these air bladders are so important, these pneumatocysts, I would love to hear what you have to say. So they have the air bladders. And then also taking a look at the blades again, if you notice here, you can see this sort of texture to it. It's kind of wavy. And that's actually providing even more surface area to come in contact with the water, getting the nutrients from the water. Now, kelp doesn't grow all over the world. It's actually found, giant kelp like this one is only found in certain locations around the world. And Southern California is one of those areas where we are fortunate enough to have kelp that grows. And it's really important. One of the reasons why it's growing here, it actually needs cooler water. You're not going to find this growing in tropical areas. This giant kelp needs cooler water temperatures for it to be able to grow and to thrive. And in those cooler waters, there's also a lot of nutrient-rich waters, a lot of upwelling, where these nutrients can be floating through the ocean. And as it's floating and the water movement is mixing it all around, these blades are able to gather those nutrients from the water. So we also have a closer, well, we'll show you a little bit later. I'm going to see if anyone has any idea as to why they have these air bladders. And Laura says to float to photosynthesize. Great job, Laura. That's exactly what they're for. They are to help this kelp to float and keep it up so that it can reach up to the very top. Because notice in this water, right behind me here in this picture, you'll notice these rays of sunlight that are coming from the surface. So there's a lot of sunlight at the top. And then this kelp, though, remember, it starts growing down at the bottom. Oh, sorry, Laura. So Laura was the one, thank you, Laura, who told us what the air bladder was for, these pneumatocysts. And Grace and Brendan guessed as well. So thank you, Grace and Brendan, for giving us that answer. And so think about it. As they're growing, they're reaching up to the top to get all of that sunlight. And then why? Photosynthesis. So how is photosynthesis working and how is it helping this organism and this habitat? Well, it's got the chlorophyll in it that is taking in the sunlight. Think about the kelp as an organism and think about the food web. The very base of the food web are the producers, right? So they are producing their own energy. They're producing energy coming from the sun and turning it into food for themselves and oxygen for other organisms. Now think about oxygen in the water. What would be a reason that something would need oxygen in the water? Are there other organisms that need oxygen in the water? Well, yes. And even we benefit from kelp and oxygen that's being produced in the water because it can come into the atmosphere and actually create a lot of the oxygen that we breathe. So we also can be we can benefit a lot from these kelp forests and their productivity. And also it's not just the kelp that's in the water that's producing oxygen that we breathe. It's also little teeny tiny phytoplankton. So phytoplankton also can be found in these kelp forest habitats. In fact, they're some of the reason why the water looks a little bit cloudy and snowy. Do you see those sort of specks? So those are lots of different nutrients. Those could be plankton also in the water as well. And so they're producing oxygen for us to breathe and oxygen for other organisms to breathe. So Anton said, air bladders used to breathe. Oh, really good question. So the air bladder is not used to help the kelp breathe. It's used to help the kelp to float, but what it allows the kelp to do is get the oxygen get the sunlight so that it can produce the oxygen that could go into the air for us to breathe. So they are linked to breathing, you could say in a way, but not directly with the kelp. So they are helping us to breathe because the air bladders help it get to the sunlight, to help it get to create the oxygen through photosynthesis that we can benefit from, but also fish in the ocean can benefit from. So we breathe air with our lungs. Fish use gills. So gills are getting the oxygen from the water, whereas we breathe the air with our lungs. They're getting it from the water with their gills. And that is how the kelp can directly benefit all the organisms living in the kelp forest. Whether they're breathing the air at the surface like a marine mammal or whether they're getting it directly from the water with their gills like a fish. Sebastian said, Are the pneumatocysts used to release toxins? Oh, that's a good question. There's actually no toxins that I'm aware of that are produced by any kelp. There are some organisms in the ocean that do produce toxins. And here's some of those marine mammals we were talking about swimming around the kelp forest. And let me stand off to the side so you can see them because they're pretty cute. So I'm going to come off camera for a second. But the question about releasing toxins, there are some plankton that are in the water. Dinoflagellates are a type of plankton that can actually produce toxins. If you've ever heard of a red tide, those are produced by these phytoplankton called dinoflagellates, or I should say dinoflagellates that produce these toxins that sometimes even make the water appear like this orangish, reddish, brownish color. But the kelp itself does not actually produce any toxins. As a matter of fact, there are other ways that the kelp can benefit other organisms in the ocean and even us. So it can be used as a source of food for a lot of animals. It can be used, in fact, we've even used kelp, and now not so much kelp. Kelp is no longer being harvested for us to use, but it is, or their relatives, it is a type of seaweed. Maybe I should go back to that. Sometimes people get confused. They're like, is kelp seaweed? Is seaweed kelp? What is that? But kelp is actually a type of seaweed. So seaweed is just a large algae, something that you can see very easily. And so obviously kelp can be seen very easily. It is considered seaweed. So just to clarify that. Hutton can stingrays hide in kelp forests? That's another great question. And where do you think a stingray would hide if they were in a kelp forest? Do you think they'd hang out in the blades? Do you think they'd hang out at the bottom? Do you think they swim at the top? Well, there's actually lots of different places a stingray could be in the kelp forest. But if you think about what the stingray body shape is like, very flat. And when you tend to see flat animals that are flattened from top to bottom, it's what we call a depressed body shape. And they tend to be animals that hang out on the bottom of the ocean. So they can hide a lot of times in the sand. They'll kind of cover themselves up. But absolutely, the kelp forest can provide great coverage for them, as well as all these other animals that you're seeing here. So this is a view from another one of our exhibits here at the aquarium. And you can see some Garibaldi in here, this little bright orange fish here. Sorry, I'm seeing another question. How and when during a kelp's life did they develop an air bladder? Oh, also from Kara? Okay, wasn't sure if it's C or K. L. So another great question. When did they develop? I would actually love to watch the development of kelp and see how quickly they do grow from one stage to the next. So I do imagine that it's fairly early on in development, but I don't know exactly how long it takes them. I can tell you that kelp does grow very quickly. In the right conditions, kelp like this, giant kelp, can grow up to 2 feet in 1 day. So that's a pretty fast-growing organism. Now, at the youngest stages of their life, I don't know exactly how long it takes them to get to that point where they have that hold fast and then they start growing up. So it's a really good question that I don't have a great answer for you. If I get any other answers from my team here to help me out, I will be sure to share that. But thank you for the question. Also, I wanted to point out this really cool animal because we've talked about the kelp forest. We haven't really talked about the animals living in it yet. This one right here happens to be a giant sea bass, which is obviously very large based on its name, but they didn't always start off that large. Animals in the kelp forest, even if they can grow big, they start off life very, very small. Oh, here's a leopard shark swimming by right now too. Now, the giant sea bass, this animal, these two big animals right here that love to come on up and get their faces in the camera there. Notice when you look at them, got these big black spots in their bodies. Oh, there's 3 of them. All 3 of them are right up in front for you guys to see. They are very slow movers. They're very curious fish, and they're fascinating animals. But they start off life really small. They actually start off life as plankton. So it might be hard to believe looking at that size, but this is an animal that starts off super tiny And we are really proud to say, here's a picture of a baby giant sea bass. You can see how different it looks from the adults. So the color is a lot different. And this is actually very common with fish. In their younger stages, they look very different than they do as adults. But this one right here has spots all over them, kind of an orange color. But this is a baby giant sea bass that was born right here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. And what you're looking at here, even though it looks really large, believe it or not, was about this big when this picture was taken. So a very small creature. But we were really excited because we're the first public aquarium to actually have success growing a baby giant sea bass to this stage. And now this fish, Utaka is his name, or her name, we don't even know. That's the interesting thing about giant sea bass, is we will not know whether they're male or female until they're about 15 years old. So it'll be a really exciting time when we figure out if we have a male or a female. But the fish's name is Utaka. And let's see, can you see Utaka? Okay, I'm being told it's on the bottom. Maybe I'm standing in front. Tell me if you see a giant sea bass anywhere in this picture, because I've been told he's in here, but I can't see him at this point. All right, it's behind the kelp. So anyway, next time you visit the aquarium, hopefully you'll look for our baby giant sea bass, which is now about this big. But they have the potential of getting up to more than 500 pounds. So a very large fish. Okay, there were some other questions coming in. They said, do humans eat kelp? I am sure that there are humans who eat kelp. I'm not one of them, but we have been known to eat various types of algae. Obviously, nori, if you ever enjoy sushi, that's basically dried out seaweed, not necessarily kelp. That is wrapped around those sushi rolls that people enjoy eating. So people do eat different types of seaweed from the ocean, and they probably do even eat giant kelp. I'm just not aware of anyone who does. All right. Anton wants to know, how is kelp collected for research? Oh, actually, kelp can be collected right off the surface. They can go through, as I mentioned earlier, we're no longer harvesting kelp for commercial purposes. And actually, before I continue your explanation, let me just say, algae and seaweed in the ocean is used in products that we use on a daily basis, believe it or not. In fact, if you enjoy ice cream and you've seen carrageenan on the side, if you've looked at the ingredient list, if you see something CAR, well, that actually is coming from the ocean. That's seaweed. And lots of salad dressings, even some cosmetics. Chocolate milk is my favorite one to talk about. Chocolate milk, if you buy it at the store, or if you get it at a school lunch, you know how it's all chocolatey all throughout? Well, that's because it has this algin in it that helps keep it together and emulsifies it. So if you make chocolate milk at home and you pour the syrup into your milk and then you stir it around, it gets all chocolatey. But if you let it sit and you don't drink it right away, which why on earth would you do that? And let it sit, it would start to settle and you would see all the chocolate syrup go down to the bottom and it'd be all kind of whitish or dirty white at the top. Well, if you get it from the store or at the school cafeteria, it doesn't do that, right? It stays chocolatey all throughout. And that's because that type of chocolate milk has this emulsifier in it. It has the algae that's keeping that chocolate all connected to the milk throughout. So kind of an interesting thing. Gelatins, jello puddings, things like that all have kelp in it, or not necessarily kelp, algae, I should say, from the ocean, seaweed. So getting back to that, do humans eat it? Yes, sometimes we eat it. How does it get harvested? They can actually, because it grows so tall and so fast and goes up to the surface, as it continues to grow, it creates a canopy. Here's a giant sea bass here. It creates a canopy across the surface or the top of the water, kind of like the canopy of a rainforest. I mentioned before that it's very similar to a rainforest. A rainforest has different layers that different types of animals can live in and find shelter and call their habitat. And so the canopy of the rainforest is the very top. So we have the canopy of a kelp forest as well. And it can actually kind of create this layer on the ocean. And I remember someone telling me, oh, if you're swimming around kelp forests, sometimes you have to kind of crawl across the top of them because they can be so thick. I didn't actually have to experience that because when I got in the water at the same place that this person was telling me about, it was much warmer. It was a different time of year and all the kelp was gone. As I mentioned earlier, kelp does need colder temperatures to grow in. And so when the temperature starts to get too high, that kelp starts to die off. And so the habitat that a friend of mine was once in with lots and lots of kelp that he was having to crawl over the surface of, I actually didn't have that experience, and it was easy to swim in. But as it grows and creates that canopy, that is how someone who's collecting kelp can go and collect it and harvest it for research. Divers can go in and collect kelp. Our divers here at the aquarium have to collect kelp for us to use for some of our animals that feed on kelp. So what other types of animals live in the kelp forest? We have the giant sea bass we were talking about, which unfortunately, their numbers started to go down because of overfishing. As I mentioned, they were very curious, and they would come up to divers, and it'd be a very easy target for spear fishermen. So their numbers started to go down because they were such large, easy to catch fish. But fortunately, because of protection and some of the exciting discoveries we've made in being able to raise some giant sea bass, we have now been able to release baby giant sea bass out into the ocean in hopes of bringing their population, their numbers right back up. So it's very exciting work to say we're a part of here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. But we're hoping to see more of these giant sea bass, not just here at the aquarium, but out in the ocean as well. All right. And so some other organisms that might be found in the giant sea bass, or in the giant sea bass, in the kelp forest, might be other fish. You may have noticed that bright orange fish that was swimming around in our kelp forest habitat we were showing you earlier, the Garibaldi. This is the state marine fish of California, and they are protected, but they do have a bright orange color as adults. Now, you might also remember me saying that giant sea bass babies look very different when they're babies versus when they're adults. Well, we also have a picture of what a baby Garibaldi looks like, and they look very different as well. Look at those bright blue spots. Very different because they don't have these at all when they are adults. So again, a very common thing for a baby version of the fish to look very different from the adult version. All right, a question from Grayson. How many types of fish at the Aquarium of the Pacific? Oh, Grayson, that's a good question. I actually don't know. I can tell you we have 12,000 animals here at the aquarium, and a number of those are fish, but I honestly don't know how many different species. So maybe about 2,000 different species. That's a guess out there. Not really sure. Someone also said, what is our biggest fish? Our biggest fish in our Blue Cavern exhibit, our kelp forest habitat here at the aquarium, is the giant sea bass right here. And that is a pretty large fish, but not as large as our largest one. So our Queensland grouper, which is in our tropical Pacific exhibit, has the potential of being about, well, even more than 500 pounds, and about the size of a small car, about 900 pounds. So that's potentially our largest fish here at the aquarium. And then I'm so glad Hutton asked this great question. Are California kelp forests pretty healthy? Well, it kind of comes and goes. So like I said, we're fortunate that we have a place here off of Southern California where we have kelp forests, but kelp forests are at risks. And so that's one of the things we want to mention too, is because the ocean is warming, as warming temperatures create a condition that isn't so ideal for kelp, it might cause those kelp forests to die off. Now, another big threat to the kelp forest is a certain animal, which I can show you right here. This is what we call a test, or the outside shell of this animal. And I'll show you a little bit closer up here too. I won't go into a lot of explanation about this, but we'll show you a picture, we just showed you a picture of one up there. So this right here is a test of a sea urchin. And the sea urchin has these little bumps all over his body where these big long spines were attached. So again, if we show you that picture, the sea urchin has purple spines, and they have the opening at the top, but they also, at the bottom, they have an opening where their mouth would be. And they like to feed on kelp. So this is a great picture of some kelp. And you can see all those sort of wavy edges we were talking about. They also have this sort of slime layer that protects them. But that sea urchin right here will chomp on this kelp with its 5 little teeth it has on the underside of its body. They kind of form this circle. They have a special mouthpiece inside called an Aristotle's lantern, the whole structure inside of them to help them eat. Has an interesting name. So their Aristotle's lantern is what they use, with these 5 teeth coming together in a circle to kind of crunch and eat, or not crunch, but to chew up the kelp. And as they chew up the kelp, since these are animals, you'll notice they don't have fins for swimming. So the sea urchins have to crawl along with their tube feet and spines. And they're found on the bottom of the ocean. And what part of the kelp is on the bottom? The holdfast. And so when the kelp eats the holdfast, we have a problem, because what's going to happen to the rest of the kelp? It's going to float away. You might see it washed up on beaches. Even the ones that you see washed up on beaches, that could just be the extra kelp that has just kind of broken off from the top because it was growing so fast and so big. But it also could be from the urchins that have been feeding on the kelp. So urchins can be a threat to the kelp if we don't have the predator of the urchin around. And we used to have a lot more of these cute little cuddly guys off our coast, but their numbers have gone down, and they're the sea urchin. So I'm sorry, the sea urchin, the sea otter. The sea otter, super cute and cuddly, a big predator of sea urchins. So as they eat those sea urchins, they keep those sea urchin populations in check so that the kelp forests don't just float away, because as that kelp flows away, it creates loss of habitat. There's also another type of seaweed that has been found growing in Southern California waters, an invasive species that has outcompeted some of the kelp, because this invasive species has been known to tolerate the warmer water. So as the ocean water temperatures rise, it causes a fine habitat for these other ones that are crowding out the giant kelp. So as the giant kelp is floating off and floating away, this invasive species is staying here. All right, we are nearly out of time, but let me try to get to a couple more questions that came in. Brendan says, do sea otters float their babies on the kelp? Yes, Brendan, I'm so glad you brought that up, since I forgot to. They'll actually wrap their babies around the kelp, or wrap the kelp around their babies, so that they can kind of be floating in space, or in one space, I should say, and not just floating all over the ocean. So they're kind of secured as mom goes off and forages and finds food for them to eat. So question. And then Emmeline says, how many types of kelp are there? And actually, there are a lot of different kinds of kelp. The ones that we were looking at that I was showing you is the giant kelp that we have. But there are different types. Green kelp, there's brown kelp, there's red kelp, I should say. These different types of kelp and algae. And there are over 1,000 different species. So it's not all the same. So here we actually have, boy, do we have 3 different kinds here? Or we've got 2. Looks like we've got, 3 different kinds of kelp that you can see, or different types of algae that are growing. And Hutton says, why are kelp blades wrinkled? Having that extra surface area also helps them to float a little bit and to help them get more nutrients from the water. And I don't know, I think it's just to feel really cool, because it feels really awesome when you touch it. Yeah, maybe it's because they're in the water all the time. They're getting all wrinkly, just like your fingers do. I don't know. I don't think that's really the reason, but it's kind of fun to think about. And let's see. I think I've gotten all of my questions. But if you still have questions, that is okay. We can still respond if you're just texting them in now, because we're a little bit delayed in getting some of the responses. But you can also email us if you're watching this from on YouTube, right in front of my giant sea bass here. Email questions to live@lbaop.org, and we will be happy to answer any questions you have. But I do need to wrap it up, because we've gone over in time. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that a number of you will get a chance to see sometime when our doors are back open, and you can come check out these animals for yourselves. But hopefully you'll even get a chance to see the animals and the kelp forest out in the natural habitat in the ocean one day. And you'll feel like you understand it just a little bit better. But thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day. And feel free to check in with any of our webcams on our website anytime to check out any of these animals and creatures. So thanks for joining us today. Bye, everyone.